Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
We welcome you to the 6th week of a 10-week series titled A Journey in Search of the Human Spirit. Each year, at about this time, we broadcast either 10 or 12 weeks that is due to a symposium that's held each spring at North Idaho College, and this year it was titled In Search of the Human Spirit. We had both local and national scholars that were involved in what we call the Chautauqua format, playing famous people in history. We want to first of all thank the Idaho Humanities Council. They've been so good to us, and over the past 6 years they have assisted in our funding along with associated students at North Idaho College and the regular funding of the Convocation Series and the North Idaho College Foundation. On the program today, we welcome from the past Mother Jones. She was born in 1830 and lived until 1930. She lived to be 100. She was born as Mary Harris Jones and became later an activist called Mother Jones. She was a labor agitator that was born in Cork, Ireland, in the year, as I've indicated, 1830. She led a rather uneventful life in the United States until the tragic death of her husband and children of a fever epidemic in 1867. She moved to Chicago, and following a number of events, she became a paid organizer for the United Mine Workers of America, and she traveled the country supporting the workers in the mines. Mother Jones, welcome to our time in history, the year 2001, and we look forward to interviewing you today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm so pleased to have our two panelists, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Steve Shink, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at Idaho College. And we will invite Janelle Burke to commence today's questioning with Mother Jones.
Mother Jones, it's a pleasure to have you here today, but your name is rather unusual. Can you tell us how you got your name? And why?
And why? Well, when I really started working in the labor movement in the 1880s, I started fairly late in life. I was in my 60s before I got my feet on the ground and really had learned my trade and developed skills as a polished orator. Now, I work with working class people who have a great deal of respect for women, a great deal of respect for mothers. And I went into these camps, and I was by that time an old woman, and I had white hair. I encouraged the people to call me Mother Jones. I referred to myself as Mother Jones.
So you were a mother figure, not a nun.
Absolutely, a mother figure. I used to refer to the miners as my boys. My boys. Yes.
Steve Shink.
Mother Jones, by the way, I'm sorry for the loss of your children and your husband, but after that happened, what was it that attracted you to work in the labor movement and particularly work with miners? Was your husband a miner?
My husband was not a miner. My husband was an iron molder. Oh. He was very active in Local 66 of the Iron Molders International Union in Memphis, Tennessee, before his death to the yellow fever epidemic. So I was introduced to union activities at a relatively early age when I was a mother raising children and supporting my husband in his trade union activities. Now, the country at that time was rife with labor strife. It was difficult not to pick up a paper and read articles about union activities. And I was attracted, after the Great Fire of 1871 in Chicago, where I lived, I took shelter with the Knights of Labor. And it was there that I listened to many speakers coming through talking about the plight of the working classes in this country. And I was so moved by their talk and so moved by the content of their speeches that I determined that this was one thing I could do for the working classes. I am an Irish Catholic working class woman. That is my roots.
I see. Maybe Tony can help me a little bit with this next question, because I'm not a very good historian, really. But I think the roots of the trade unions in this country go back to guilds in Europe. Is that correct? That maybe even originated in the Middle Ages. But could you give us a little bit of a historic backdrop? What were unions like? You said there was lots of labor strife, but what was the status of unions in that last third of the 19th century when you were drawn to the movement? Did they have any strength, any ability to negotiate on behalf of their members?
They were actually, some of the trade unions did have some strength, but it was fairly localized. I know that trade unions were very common in this country even as early as the 1840s, in the 1850s, and I believe even in the 1830s. So on a very small scale and on a regional level and within cities, workers were very protective of their skills, and so trade unions were quite common. And in fact, that is what my husband George belonged to, was a trade union, an iron molders union. And this was a time when the unions began actually to coalesce and to develop as a strength in this country.
Thank you.
Mother Jones, I'll follow up on Steve's question, and that is, you lived long enough to see some great success dying in 1930, because it was in the early part of the 20th century that labor unions began to really find their way into more support in government officials. Of course, it would be 2 years after your death before Franklin D. Roosevelt became president. He was in many ways very supportive, but as the Industrial Revolution taking place in the 1800s and latter part in particular, and we moved in the 20th century, you saw that. So my question would be, from the beginning of your cause until your death, and as you traveled and crisscrossed this country, you didn't even have a residence.
I did not own a home.
You traveled with very little. Just share with us how it was at the beginning of your work in the movement as contrasted with near the end of your life.
There was, at the beginning of my involvement with the labor unions, there was much strife. In the latter part of the 19th century and the very early part of the 20th century, workers often took to the streets. They clashed with Pinkerton agents, they clashed with policemen, they clashed with militia. Governors of states often called in militia to quell these workers' riots. I can say that towards the latter part of my life, unions had established a much stronger foothold. The plight of workers was finally brought to the attention of Washington and the citizens at large. I testified before several hearings in Washington, D.C. For example, when I spoke of the Ludlow massacre in Colorado in 1915, when miners were attacked by a wild and out-of-control militia group, and 17 miners, 11 children, and 2 women were killed. Now, in Washington, finally, an industrial commission called John D. Rockefeller to task for that, and they started to look into the conditions of the miners. And at this time, I truly believed and believe that unions' strength was beginning to be acknowledged. The citizens of the country were taking more notice of the appalling working conditions of these people.
I want to talk just a little bit about your concern for children, because in the movement in those days, before we had modern statutes and one interpretation of the U.S. Constitution and also child labor laws, you had a story today that you told about a 7-year-old child that worked like 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Tell us how you addressed the plight of children in labor.
I spent some time in 1896 and 97 working in the cotton mills of the South, one in particular out of Cottondale, Alabama. Now, you must understand that in the South, women, the textile mills of the South hired as high as 30% of their workforce were women and children in the cotton mills of the South. Now, these children worked, as Tony said, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. The rule was sun up to sundown. Now, you can imagine what the hours might be like in the summer. And they worked 6 days a week. Now, these children had no time for education. I saw so many of them with their digits, missing. Their fingers would have been caught in the machinery when they were too tired and they started to fall asleep. They would lose a finger or hand. I saw little girls with hair ripped out of their heads when their hair was caught in the machinery. Now, in 1903, I helped organize Philadelphia's textile workers, and 100,000 of them went out on strike. Now, there were 16,000 children, many of them under the ages of 10, who were working in the textile mills of Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia area in 1903. And many of those little children had lost fingers and hands. I tried for years to get the president and President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, to support federal child labor legislation that would keep these children out. Many states had passed state legislation, but it was ignored. Children under the ages of 12 were not to work in the mines. Some of them under the ages of 14, a parent would have to sign a permission slip, or they were starving, and many of them were illiterate. And their children went into work. It didn't make any difference how old they were.
Janelle Berg.
In our time, working conditions are quite different, but still very, very important. The condition under which we work, we spend a great number of hours at our jobs, so it's very important. Tell us some of the things that you worked on. I'm sure you worked on safety. I'm sure you must have worked on issues that dealt with longevity, with some kind of security for the workers. What were the issues that you were really involved in your time, Mother Jones?
The primary issues that we worked on were wages and the hours of labor. Most people, when they worked in the factories or they worked in the mines, were working a minimum of 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In fact, when I took those Philadelphia textile workers out on strike, they were asking for a 55-hour work week. That's 6 days a week, 55 hours. They were working 60-hour weeks. There had been a couple of attempts to get an 8-hour workday approved and adopted by industrialists in this country, and it just simply took more years than I was around to see that occur.
But that was the major thing you were working for.
Salaries, yes, ma'am, and honest weighmen at the mines. Many of the miners, when they would have their day's production weighed, had a weighman who cheated them on the weight of the coal that they had produced. They were underpaid.
Steve Sheen. Mother Jones, you were a labor organizer.
A labor organizer.
What did that work entail? What would you typically be doing?
Normally, I would get a call. I was on the payroll of the United Mine Workers of America beginning about 1899. And the United Mine Workers would call me in and they would say, Mother, we're going to organize the coal fields of Pennsylvania or Colorado, and we want you to go in. We want you to bring those men out on strike. Usually I was assigned a district. For example, in Colorado, I was sent into the southern coal fields, and other labor organizers for the UMWA were sent into the northern coal fields. And what we would do is we would get those men to walk off the job. We would get them to sign up as members of our union, and we would keep them out until the officials of the UMWA had a chance to sit down with the mine owners and negotiate a working agreement.
Now, I hate to leap forward in time too much to your untimely death at the tender age of 100, but I note from our materials here that you were actually buried after Mass in Washington, D.C. You were taken specifically to Mount Olive, Illinois, to be buried in a miners' cemetery, which I guess commemorated the Verdun coal riot of 1898. Were you there at that riot?
I was in Chicago during the time of that riot. I was not an active participant, but I was there, yes.
Were you yourself ever involved in any instances where strikes led to violence and where miners and mine supporters were injured or killed?
Oh, yes. The Ludlow incident in Colorado, and that was in 1915, when militia went on a rampage. General Chase lost control of the state militia, and they fired into the tents. They set fire to them. They went in and they beat the miners and their wives and children and stole from them. I was there when that occurred. I organized a district of West Virginia, the Paint Cabin Creek District. And at one time when I went in to organize, an injunction was issued against my being there. I could not walk on any mining property. So I walked in the creek beds. The creeks weren't owned by the mines. And I walked through the creek beds. I walked up on the road, though, and I was stopped by a group of militia. And they pointed their guns at me, and they said, "Mother, if you take one more step, we're firing."
From what you're telling us, Mother Jones, most of the violence directed against miners and their supporters was from either officials of government, police or militia of some kind, or I assume there were agents, paid agents, security agents of the mines themselves. What was the reaction of the general public to your unions and your organization work and the strikes? How did the public support you?
The public, for the most part, did not really understand nor know what was going on in many parts of the country during these strikes. You see, many of these mines were located in very uninhabited areas. They were very far from civilization. And in that day, it was hard to get the word out about the conditions of mines and miners. It was extremely difficult. In fact, Ludlow was the breaking point. That was when finally the press broke the story about the conditions of mines, and it ran as front page news. So it took us many years to bring the plight of the miners to the attention of the public.
Thank you.
Mother Jones, our week here on A Journey in Search of the Human Spirit, we've had a number of historical characters, and you and Mother Teresa and a number of other people, and even from a somewhat a little bit different time in history, really led a very simple life. You were not conspicuous consumers. I believe you had, as you traveled, only 2 outfits. And would you tell us exactly what you traveled with, and why did you choose to live with so little? And I know that you sometimes were paid as an organizer by the United Mine Workers of America, but you never had any real wealth, did you?
No, I never had any real wealth. You see, I traveled from one strike to another strike. I was always on the road. Peripatetic, you might say. It's difficult to own property when one moves around the country constantly. I had made the decision early in my organizing years that the only way to move and move quickly is to move with damn little. And that's what I took with me. I carried a carpet bag with a change of clothes in it, my handbag, and my hat, and that was it.
And as you did that and went places, and at times I'm sure you were low on finances, where did you stay? Did you stay with some of the miners?
I stayed with the miners. The miners would put me up. They opened their homes to me. The mill workers opened their homes to me and let me in. They'd put me on the floor. I'd often sleep on the floor. Sometimes I would be given the only bed, the bed for the guest of honor, I guess. Yes. My digs were not fancy, I can tell you.
At times did you go hungry?
I went hungry. I ate only what the miners ate.
And in relation to that, one other question that has to do with, really, I would say basically in poverty. You chose to do that, to work for others and their rights. Did you find travel at times dangerous, or were you almost always traveling alone?
Most of the time, yes, I did travel alone. Was it dangerous? Not particularly. I never felt threatened in traveling. As a matter of fact, a lot of the porters with the railroads and sometimes the engineers recognized me. After a few years, I became such a notorious character that it was hard for me to disappear when I wanted to. And they would see me coming down to the railroad and they'd say, "Mother, where are you going?" And I'd say, "I'm off to West Virginia, boys, to organize the mines." And they'd say, "Hop aboard, Mother, we'll give you a ride."
Janelle Berg.
I have a series of little questions. One is, how did you communicate? You've indicated you communicated with union leaders, but how did you communicate? Was that by telegraph or was it by letter? How did you communicate?
Telegraph and letter, but primarily letters. I wrote quite a few letters. They were usually very short and to the point.
Were you concerned about someone intercepting them?
That had happened before. Once when I was imprisoned, actually I was under house arrest, and a reporter came to me. I tried to smuggle out some communications to the union leadership, which I do believe were intercepted, though I have no proof of that.
And how did you travel about the country? You mentioned the train, of course, but you must have traveled by other means as well.
I traveled by buggy. I traveled my 2 feet. You know, one senator once asked me, he said, "Mother, where do you live? What is your address?" And I said to him, I said, "Well, Senator, I don't rightly know where it is. Now, I do live in these United States of America, and my address is wherever there's a fight against oppression." Now, that could be in Washington, D.C., it could be in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, but my address is like my shoes. It travels with me. Now, I walked a good deal of the way.
And the final question is, you've talked about organizing the mines, organizing the textile workers. What other areas did you organize?
I organized steel workers. I organized the brewery girls in Milwaukee. They were young women who worked for Mr. Blatz in some of the worst conditions imaginable for very little money. So I went in and I pulled them out on strike.
Steve Sheen.
Mother Jones, was there any differentiation between the conditions women and children worked under and the conditions that the men had to endure, or was it uniformly bad in your time?
It was uniformly bad in many of the mills in particular and in the mines. I can say that men were always paid more than the women. One of the reasons the textile mills loved hiring, the mill owners loved hiring women and children was because they could pay them so little. When I talked about the little girl today whose family I lived with when I worked in the South in the textile mills in Cottondale, I gave that little girl a dime to remember Lucy, because that's what Lucy made for 12 hours of work a day, was a dime.
An unrelated question, Mother Jones. You mentioned very early on in our show that it took you a while to polish your skills as an orator. Are you an educated woman? Did you have any formal education, or have you just learned what you know by the School of Hard Knocks?
I've had a modest amount of formal education. Now, my parents did believe that the key to a better life was some education, and they sent all of us to school when I lived in Toronto. So I had probably what would be equivalent today to an 8th grade education. I could read and write. My spelling may be another story. It does take my friends some deciphering sometimes to come up with a message, but I did have some schooling. But much of it was just learned in the School of Hard Knocks.
Thank you.
On that note, we're going to ask our guests to come out of character. Under the Chautauqua format, that's always a very wise thing to do, and I will introduce Mother Jones has been played by Denise Clark, and Denise Clark is a public service librarian at North Idaho College in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. She holds a baccalaureate degree in English and theater arts from Michigan State University and a master's degree in library science from Western Michigan University. Denise, you've been playing Mother Jones for some time, and you had an hour's performance this morning before a General Assembly, and you've done this at banquets and other places, and even in the town square in Wallace, Idaho, calling the workers of that town to action in this role-playing. What would you like to say about Mother Jones now as Denise Clark?
As Denise Clark. Mother Jones was a very interesting character. Just a little earlier we were talking about her, and she gives her birth date as 1830. In her autobiography, The Autobiography of Mother Jones, which she did publish in 1925. However, most scholars have come to an agreement that Mother Jones was not born in 1830, probably 1837, perhaps as late as 1843, though I think most have settled on about an 1837 date. She's probably the only woman I know who deliberately made herself older instead of younger.
What else? She was such a colorful person.
A very colorful person.
And was very, very popular. Upon her death, with the time we have left, that's an interesting story about where the mass took place and the trip to where she wanted to be buried.
When Mother Jones died in 1930, there was a high mass said for her in Washington, D.C., and her body was on view at the Oddfellows Hall in Washington, D.C. briefly, and then it was placed on a train where it was transported, as Steve said, to Mount Olive Cemetery. She wanted to be buried with the 7 miners who were killed during the Verdun coal mine strike of 1898, as she called them, always referred to them as the Verdun martyrs. And her wish was honored. Now, when her body was placed on that train, it followed the same route that Lincoln's body followed from Washington, D.C. to Illinois, where he was buried. Now, during that whole trip, working class people and miners turned out to wait for that train to pass to pay their last respects to Mother Jones. Thousands of people turned out. In Mount Olive, there is a little church that holds about 200 people, and a service was to be held there for her burial. 5,000 people turned out for that funeral.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. Denise Clark, as portraying Mother Jones, thank you for being with us today, and I thank the panel for their fine questions. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall continue our PBS series as we've titled it, A Journey in Search of the Human Spirit, next week, when we'll move to yet another historical character and deal with another question and the contribution someone else made to our society. We hope you're enjoying this series. We certainly are enjoying bringing it to you. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.